Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on industrial depth, fiscal capacity, and the structure of Union victory. The core question is this: what kind of state can keep fighting long enough for industrial depth, transport, and fiscal reach to decide the war? The core competency is to summarize the factors that contributed to a Union victory over the seceding Southern states. What kind of state can keep fighting long enough for industrial depth, transport, and fiscal reach to decide the war? Union victory rested on scale, but scale alone did not guarantee success. The North possessed a larger population, more factories, more machine shops, more railroad track, more shipyards, and a more developed financial system than the Confederacy. Those advantages changed events because the war lasted 4 years. A shorter conflict might have turned more heavily on local command or one decisive campaign. A long war rewarded the side that could replace losses, finance repeated offensives, and keep public support alive through setbacks. Federal finance sat near the center of that structure. Armies had to be paid, weapons had to be purchased, railroads had to move troops and supplies, ships had to be built, repaired, and crewed, hospitals had to be provisioned. Congress and the Treasury therefore expanded the fiscal reach of the federal government during the war. The Legal Tender Act authorized greenbacks, new taxes, including the first federal income tax, increased revenue. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase relied on bond sales marketed to banks and ordinary citizens. War required not only courage at the front, but confidence in the credit of the United States. Industrial depth made that money useful. Northern foundries could produce cannon, shot, rails, engines, and iron plate. Textile mills could supply uniforms and blankets. Workshops repaired wagons, locomotives, and weapons. Private contractors often worked with the War Department on massive orders, and corruption or waste sometimes appeared. But the North still possessed a wider productive base than the Confederacy. If one factory fell short, the government often had alternatives. That redundancy gave the Union staying power in prolonged conflict. The practical sequence controls the explanation. Congress raises money, Treasury borrows more, quartermasters contract for goods, factories produce them, railroads move them, depots sort them, armies receive them. A battlefield victory or defeat sits at the end of that chain, not outside it. Union victory cannot be understood without the chain itself. Transportation made industrial and fiscal advantages usable. The Union possessed far more railroad mileage than the Confederacy, and northern rail lines connected large industrial centers to major depots and troop concentrations. Railroads carried soldiers, artillery, food, forage, replacement horses, and mail. They also carried news. Telegraph lines often followed rail corridors, allowing faster coordination between Washington and field commanders. A government that could move men and information quickly had a better chance of turning raw resources into timed campaigns. River control added another layer. The Mississippi Valley functioned as a major strategic corridor. Union victories at Forts Henry and Donelson in 1862, then at Vicksburg in 1863, steadily improved federal control over the western waterways. Once Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, the Confederacy was divided more sharply east to west. Supplies, troops, and communication could no longer move as easily across the river system. This was a geographical fact with political consequences because it weakened Confederate claims that independence remained achievable. The naval blockade tightened from 1861 through 1865 as well. The Union Navy expanded from a modest pre-war force into a large wartime fleet. Blockading squadrons patrolled the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, captured or deterred blockade runners, and reduced the Confederacy's ability to import manufactured goods or export cotton. Wilmington, Charleston, and Mobile remained important access points, but even successful blockade running could not solve the Confederacy's structural shortages. Imported rifles, medicine, machinery, and cloth came in too slowly and too unevenly to equalize the broader imbalance. Blockade pressure also affected Confederate finance. Cotton exports had once promised diplomatic leverage and foreign earnings. When exports dropped and imports became riskier, the Confederate government faced deeper supply and inflation problems. The blockade must be read as an economic pressure system, not only as a naval map feature. Large resources did not win the war until Union leaders learned how to use them with sustained coordination. Ulysses S. Grant became central to that shift. After successful Western campaigns, he took broader command in 1864 and pursued simultaneous pressure across several theaters. The idea was straightforward and brutal: keep Confederate armies from recovering by forcing them to respond in multiple places at once. Grant's overland campaign against Robert E. Lee produced appalling casualties, but it also reflected a calculation about replacement capacity. The Union could replenish men and material better than the Confederacy could. William Tecumseh Sherman applied similar logic in Georgia and the Carolinas. After taking Atlanta in 1864, his forces marched to Savannah and later northward, damaging rail lines, depots, mills, warehouses, and other infrastructure that supported Confederate armies and civilian resistance. This was war against the system that kept Confederate armies in the field. It weakened morale and demonstrated that the Confederacy could no longer protect large sections of its own interior. Black soldiers made Union victory stronger in both practical and political terms. Nearly 180,000 black men served in Union armies, many in the United States colored troops. Their service enlarged the manpower pool, reduced pressure on white regiments in some sectors, and transformed emancipation into armed participation in the nation's future. The United States Navy also employed many black sailors. Their presence on transports, gunboats, and warships formed part of the same manpower story. The Confederate side of the pressure must also remain visible. Desertion increased in many areas as hardship grew. Inflation damaged civilian confidence. State governors sometimes resisted central Confederate authority. Rail lines deteriorated. Horses and mules became harder to replace. Food distribution faltered. These problems did not mean the South lacked will. They meant that will could not fully compensate for structural weakness after repeated losses and shrinking supply. The Union election of 1864 belongs here too. Lincoln had to win re-election in the middle of war. Victories at Atlanta and elsewhere helped sustain Northern confidence. Political endurance changed events because a war can be lost at the ballot box if the home front no longer accepts its cost. Union victory therefore depended on maintaining electoral legitimacy as well as military pressure. The Gettysburg Address serves as the tactical source because it connects battlefield sacrifice to the larger reason the Union continued fighting. Lincoln spoke in November 1863 after the Union victory at Gettysburg. He described the war as a test of whether a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. That sentence did more than honor the dead. It gave political meaning to continued sacrifice. The address belongs in a lecture about Union victory because factories, taxes, bonds, and railroads do not operate in a political vacuum. Citizens had to accept enlistments, mourn repeated casualties, tolerate taxes, and continue lending to the government. Lincoln's speech transformed endurance into civic obligation. The dead were said to have consecrated the ground more fully than any speech could, but the living still had work to do. His phrase, "new birth of freedom," did similar work. By late 1863, the war could no longer be explained as simple restoration of the old Union. Emancipation, black service, and the scale of sacrifice had altered the stakes. Victory now pointed toward a different republic, one in which slavery would have to end if the sacrifice was to mean anything lasting. The address therefore tied moral purpose to structural persistence. The speech belongs beside industrial and fiscal development. The federal government could finance war because people still believed the Union cause was worth the debt and blood. The address did not create that belief alone, but it articulated it at a crucial moment. A republic at war needs machinery. It also needs language that makes the machinery bearable to the people funding and manning it. Lincoln's address also marked a chronological threshold. Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 had already shifted momentum. Lincoln's speech explained why those gains had to be carried forward. In that sense, the address belongs inside the victory mechanism rather than outside it. By 1865, the combined weight of Union advantages had become overwhelming. Grant pinned Lee near Petersburg and Richmond. Sherman moved north after his Georgia campaign. Philip Sheridan devastated Confederate capacity in the Shenandoah Valley. The blockade continued to constrict trade. Rail and supply problems deepened across the Confederacy. Confederate armies could still fight stubbornly, but they did so with shrinking reserves, weaker transport, and growing civilian exhaustion. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. Other Confederate forces followed in the weeks after. The surrender sequence changed events because it confirmed that Union strategy had succeeded in destroying the Confederate ability to continue coordinated resistance. Yet battlefield surrender alone did not settle the central issue that had generated the war. That is why the 13th Amendment belongs here. Congress had already sent it to the states, and ratification later in 1865 abolished slavery throughout the United States except as punishment for crime. The amendment converted wartime emancipation into permanent constitutional change. The whole structure must be heard at once. Federal finance kept armies supplied, industrial depth kept them armed, railroads and rivers kept them moving. The blockade tightened economic pressure. Grant and Sherman converted those capacities into operational strain. Black soldiers increased manpower and linked victory to freedom.
Lincoln's political leadership sustained public commitment long enough for those advantages to mature. Confederate weakness in transport, industry, credit, and population made recovery harder after each major loss. This is why the phrase "the North had more stuff" is too thin. The Union did have more resources, but victory came from organizing those resources repeatedly and effectively from 1861 through 1865. A larger state turned money into contracts, contracts into goods, goods into armies, and armies into campaigns. It also turned emancipation into military manpower and constitutional outcome. The interaction of those pieces explains victory better than any single heroic narrative. The final judgment problem remains worth assigning. What contributed most to Union victory? Industrial depth, fiscal capacity, manpower, blockade and transport, or strategic coordination under Grant and Sherman? A strong answer can rank them only after tracing how they worked together. Industrial power without finance would stall. Finance without transport would sit in depots. Transport without men would carry empty equipment. Men without command would waste lives. Command without replacement capacity would collapse after heavy loss. Union victory therefore emerged from a system stronger than the Confederacy's and better able to survive error, loss, and time. That system was not morally pure, and it did not remove every political conflict that would follow. It did, however, prove capable of defeating the Confederacy and ending slavery through war and amendment. That outcome must be clear before Reconstruction begins. Two additional points strengthen the fiscal story. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 helped stabilize wartime finance by creating a network of nationally chartered banks and a more uniform currency tied to federal bonds. The government also drew support from civilian organizations such as the United States Sanitary Commission, which helped channel supplies and care to soldiers through volunteer networks. Those institutions did not replace federal authority, but they widened the support system behind it. Nashville's fall in 1862 and Atlanta's fall in 1864 should also be heard as structural events. Both cities functioned as rail hubs, depot points, and symbols of control. When the Union captured and held such places, it did more than raise flags. It took over movement corridors, disrupted Confederate planning, and demonstrated that Southern territory could be occupied and used against the Confederacy itself. That kind of attrition in space and infrastructure made Appomattox easier to imagine long before Lee actually surrendered. Time itself became one more Union advantage. Every additional campaign season favored the side that could issue more bonds, repair more rails, build more ships, and refill more regiments. Time was not neutral in the Civil War. It rewarded the government with deeper reserves and stronger administrative reach. Union victory came from a government able to turn population, factories, credit, transport, and political language into sustained pressure from 1861 through 1865. The harder judgment is whether such administrative strength should be read mainly as democratic capacity or as the emergence of a state whose reach would keep growing after the war. Military success settled the battlefield without ending that larger question.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.